Thanks for being around. And I'm also thankful to Dr. Jha, who has covered already many of the industrial synchrotron radiation activity. So that allows me to focus on certain aspects of some specific uh, problems or research areas that we can explore using different facilities uh, on some specific topics yesterday we had some discussions about the thin films of spintronic materials. So how can we use that in the synchrotron radiation facility to characterize our sample and in a way to probe our own set of experimental problems and in what way we can extract the information related to electronic or the magnetic properties or the electrical properties of a given material. As I said that the mandate of our consortium is to help users for using the mega research facilities created by Department of Atomic Energy. And in Indore, we have this RRCAT in the synchrotron sources. And using that in the synchrotron sources, we provide various experimental tools and experimental stations, which allow us to do different characterization techniques using this synchrotron beam. So before continuing, just for the sake of completion, I will say what is synchrotron beam. So we know that whenever we have relativistically high moving electron being forced to change its direction, and that change in direction can be obtained by some bending magnet, then it emits electromagnetic radiation. And those electromagnetic radiation is emitted in a very narrowed cone, and it is very, very high intense, high brilliance, and it has a very unique property of retaining a good polarization. So it is polarized, and if you look at the center of the beam, it is linearly polarized, and away from the center, it is circularly polarized. On top, it is, say, right-handed circularly, but then at bottom, it is like it is left-handed circularly polarized. So these properties make synchrotron beam very unique and very versatile to probe wide range of properties of a given material. Here is the just comparison of the brilliance or the intensity of the light or the brightness, as we can call, right from candle to this bending magnet synchrotron source, which is like 10 to the power 5 photons per second per millimeter square, per milliradian square. And this intensity can be further enhanced by using other insertion devices like undulator or wigglers, so that allows further to enhance the intensity of the light which is coming out of that synchrotron source. So the advantages of synchrotron source over lab source is like it can have a very wide range of photons available for different experiments, right from infrared to X-rays. Then it emits that high intense brilliance light in a very narrowed angle. It is pulsed in nature, and the pulse duration is like as short as 50 picoseconds or something of that sort. And I already discussed about its degree of polarization. It has a very high degree of polarization, which is linear in the plane of orbit and elliptical above and below the plane of orbit. So when we have that synchrotron beam coming from the source, then we really need to do some experiments, and we need to carry that synchrotron beam, high intense beam, to our experimental station, and there we can do different set of experiments. So the beam line is nothing but a connection from the synchrotron source to our experimental station, and at this beam line we have different other components also. Those components allow us to tune the incident photon energy which is desired by us, that okay, for doing this set of experiment I need this particular photon energy, whereas for some other set of experiments the required photon energy can vary. So we need to have a tunable or controllable unit to tune the incident photon energy. So accordingly, people generally use different gratings or double crystal monochromators, which allow us to select a particular photon energy for our set of experiments. Now, at RRCat Indore, we have two Indus synchrotron sources, unique facility in the country. One is the Indus 1 synchrotron source and another is this Indus 2 synchrotron source. Indus 1 is a 450 MeV machine, whereas Indus 2 is 2.5 GeV machine. And both Indus 1 and Indus 2 synchrotron sources are running very effectively round the clock mode. And there are different set of experiments that one can do at these different beam lines. Of course, the energy ranges are different and the experimental tools which are available for research, they are different. So at Indus 1, I will just show you that what are these set of facilities which are available. This is how RRCat complex looks like. This is Indus 1 synchrotron and this is the section of tunnel section of Indus 2 synchrotron source. This is the workstation, working area of Indus. And here is this Indus 1 synchrotron source, and its circumference is like 18.96 meter, and as I said that it is 450 MeV machines. At present, 6 beam lines are operational at this particular Indus 1 synchrotron source, and these are the beam lines and the available energy range. So you can see that one can do high resolution vacuum UV spectroscopy, angle integrated photoelectron spectroscopy, angle resolved photoelectron spectroscopy, soft X-ray reflectivity, photophysics, infrared, photo absorption spectroscopy, and the energy range is varied in this particular thing, right? So this is all about Indus 1. This is the tunnel junction of Indus 2, and since its circumference is higher, it allows us to tune a higher energy range. And these are the experimental stations and the available energy tools for this particular set of experiments. And you can see here that one can do the soft X-ray absorption spectroscopy, soft X-ray reflectivity, imaging beam line, and in this imaging beam line, using the different density contrast of different materials, one can capture its image and can probe various properties. Then X-ray lithography beam line, what it allows us is to pattern pattern a given material in different geometry as per the desired. Then one can do dispersive and scanning extended X-ray absorption fine structure. Dr. Jha just talked about it. Then one can also do angle dispersive or energy dispersive X-ray diffraction, angle dispersive X-ray diffraction in different photon energy ranges. X-ray photoelectron spectroscopy in the energy range of 2 kilo electron volts to 15 kilo electron volt. Microprobe X-ray fluorescence beamline, protein crystallography for biological samples, photoemission electron microscopy beamline, then visible diagnostic beamline and X-ray diagnostic beamline. So a wide range of experimental tools are available as far as research is concerned for different set of materials. Our own consortium was actively involved in creating 2 beamlines, one at Indus 1 and another at Indus 2. At Indus 1, we created this angle integrated photoelectron spectroscopy beamline, whereas at Indus 2, we had this soft X-ray absorption spectroscopy beamline. So I will mostly talk about these 2 particular beamlines because Dr. Jha has already covered many of the aspects of these beamlines. Besides these beamlines, as I said, those beamlines were available with the bending magnet source. So it has a limitation in terms of intensity or the brightness of the emitted photons. Whereas using this wiggler or undulator devices, one can further enhance its brilliance, and there are 5 beam lines at BL 5, 10, 15, 20, and 25, where the further advancement is taking place to perform different set of experiments. So that will further enhance the overall level of the experiments which is possible. This is how Indus 2 synchrotron radiation source experimental hall look like. And one can also write a comprehensive project, long-term project, utilizing these beam lines through us. We have an opening of collaborative research scheme whose last date is 31st August. So I urge all of you to visit our web page, and they can write a detailed proposal for utilizing these beamlines or any other in-house facilities which I discussed yesterday, to write their proposal. And your, of course, as I already said, that your accommodation, etc., will be taken care by us. And another thing is that besides using this long-term proposal, one can also use this particular facility for a single shot of experiment, not essentially need to have a long-term proposal. So they can also visit this RRCAT web page, and there they can just apply for the different beamlines which are available. Now coming to this angle integrated photoelectron spectroscopy beamline, that is how this beamline looks like, and this is our experimental station. And the name tells us that we do angle integrated photoelectron spectroscopy measurement at this particular beamline. And these are the specifications which are available. So this experimental station is equipped with 2 X-ray gun, as well as it is connected with the synchrotron source. And in that synchrotron source, one can tap the energy range of 10 electron volt to 200 electron volt. And also one can vary the temperature from 100 Kelvin to 450 degrees centigrade. So one can do different sets of experiments using this photoelectron spectroscopy. Now, before going into that, let's try to understand what is photoelectron spectroscopy. In photoelectron spectroscopy, the name tells us we use the photoelectric effect. What is photoelectric effect? The Einstein's discovery of photoelectric effect. We shine the photon on a given material. The photon energy is absorbed by the electron, and that electron, after overcoming its binding energy, they are emitted in the vacuum after overcoming the work function. And that emitted electron has certain kinetic energy, and if we can measure its kinetic energy, then since we know the incident photon energy, we can calculate that what was the binding energy of the emitted photoelectron. Now, since the binding energy of the emitted photoelectron is characteristic of different elements in their different charge state, so it allows us to identify what kind of element is present in our system. Just excuse me, please. Excuse me. So what it allows us to probe the different elements present in a given material, number one. Number two, it also allows us to probe that what is the charge state of the element in the given compound. Okay. Number three, if we shine our incident photon in such a way that it allows us to probe the valence band electron also, because the valence band electron will have a much lesser binding energy as compared to their core electrons. So one can also probe the valence band electrons which are coming out from this system. So just by looking at the different energy states, one can easily understand that since the core levels binding energy is very, very large, so to eject those core level electrons, we really need a very high incident photon energy, which is generally available with X-ray sources. So therefore, we use X-ray sources to eject core level electrons and then probe the kinetic energy of the emitted photoelectron. And after mapping that kinetic energy, we can identify that what is the element present in this system. So that technique is called as X-ray photoelectron spectroscopy. Whereas if I'm using only ultraviolet sources whose energy is like say 20 electron volt or 40 electron volt, depending on helium-1 or helium-2 sources that we are using, one can emit the electrons from the valence band, and then one can map the valence band spectra. So that kind of spectra will be giving us the information related to the valence band of the material. So we can have a core level spectra which can be obtained using X-ray sources that we call as X-ray photoelectron spectroscopy. We can have valence band spectra where we can really probe the distribution of electronic states or density of states close to the Fermi level, which will give us the information related to the valence band spectra in the given system. Now, as I said that when we have this photoelectron emission, then in that photoelectron emission process, when that X-ray sources X-ray photon is being absorbed by the electron, suppose that it is being absorbed by the electron in the K shell, then the K cell electron is emitted out and we have this photo emitted electron. Now, once we have this electron coming out from that K cell, there is a hole. Now that hole is being occupied by the electron from the higher orbit. Now, when that electron from higher orbit comes to occupy that particular hole, then what it can do, either it can radiate that photon, because whenever there is electron transition from higher energy state to lower energy state, it will emit the photon, right? That is one possibility. And another possibility is that besides or other, in place of emitting photon, that photon energy is being used to eject another electron from that excited level. Suppose that electron has come from this level to this level, but that photo emission which could have happened is not there, but that photon energy is used to eject an electron from another level, from higher energy electron level. So it knocks out another electron. So that electron is not actually the photo emitted electron, rather they are OJ electrons, OJ electron emission. So even that electron is coming out in the photoelectron process besides the photoelectron. So how do we make a distinction? Remember, the photoelectron's characteristic is their binding energy, whereas the characteristic of OJ electron is their kinetic energy. So just by probing the kinetic energy or the binding energy of the emitted electron, so one can identify whether the emitted electron is the photoelectron or the kinetic or the OJ electron. To really identify that particular aspect, whether the emitted electron is photoelectron or the OJ electron, we need to have two X-ray sources in our chamber, so that when we have two X-ray sources, then we have two incident photon energy. So if the binding energy is constant for the photoelectron, then if I record that particular spectra by two incident photon energy, then on the binding energy scale, the peak position will not change at all. But if the peak position changes its position on the binding energy scale with different incident photon energy, then we can say that, okay, this photon energy, this particular feature is nothing but the OJ electron feature. So that is how one can make a distinction between photoelectron as well as OJ electron, which is coming out from my sample. So what do we do using X-ray photoelectron spectroscopy? We generally use X-ray photoelectron spectroscopy to understand, to know about the kind of elements present in this system. Number one. Number two, the concentration of the element present in this system. One important thing is that it is a highly surface sensitive technique that we have to understand, because when that photoelectron is coming out, the whole purpose is to measure its original binding energy. And to measure its original binding energy, we really need to know what was its original kinetic energy, because we have h nu equals binding energy plus kinetic energy plus phi. Okay, so our experimental setup is configured in such a way that the work function of the sample does not come into equation, rather it's the work function of the spectrometer. So that is always constant for different set of materials, for any material actually, or for different experiments. So since that is constant, so the only varying thing is either the binding energy or the kinetic energy, vice versa. So our purpose of probing this photoelectron spectroscopy or X-ray photoelectron spectroscopy is to know the binding energy of the emitted photoelectron. To do that, we have to measure its original kinetic energy. So if the electron which is coming out from my sample, before reaching my detector, if it interacts with other ambience, with other electrons, with other deformations in the system, then because of that interaction, it will lose some of its kinetic energy. And therefore, it can show a different kinetic energy measured in my analyzer. And then we can make an error in estimating in its original binding energy. Therefore, it is very important to really understand that those electrons which are very close to the surface, maybe 2 to 3 nanometer, which is generally given by the mean free path of the electron before reaching at the detector, so that it retains its original kinetic energy. So in this particular photon range, this mean free path is of the order of 2 nanometer or so. Therefore, it is a highly surface sensitive technique. Since we know that the electron has a charged particle, therefore, because of that charged particle, any other distribution in the electric gradient or the electric field gradient or the potential, it starts interacting, and therefore it has a huge chance of losing its original kinetic energy. Therefore, it is a highly surface sensitive technique. Number one. Number two, because of that, since those electrons, when they come out, they also interact with the kind of free electrons available in this system or the valence electron present in this system. Therefore, it has a certain background, and it has certain plasmon state, it has certain satellite structures. So all these things make photoelectron spectroscopy a unique technique. Just by looking into their satellite structure, one can really understand that, okay, what kind of state this particular element can have, because this satellite structure arises because of the interaction of the ejected photoelectron with the valence electron, and because of its certain way of exchanging energy and losing its kinetic energy, it creates altogether a different feature away from its original binding energy states. So these things allow us really to probe many other aspects of the given material. So it allows us to probe the kind of elements present in the system. It also, since if in my system there can be some contamination which we may not know, just by looking into the survey scan, we can really identify that if some foreign element has come in my system or not. Since the intensity of the emitted photoelectron will depend on the stoichiometry of that particular element, so it allows us to also make an empirical formula for the given material. And importantly, it also gives us the information related to the chemical state of the element in which is present in the given material. Now here is this survey spectra. You can see that in this survey spectra, this was recorded using aluminum K alpha, which has a photon energy of 1486 around 1486 electron volt. So with that incident photon energy, this is one of the composition which is La 0.7 Sr 0.3 MnO3. So in my system, I have lanthanum also, strontium also, manganese also, oxygen also. And in all these elements, we have different electronic configuration, 1s, 2s, 2p, 3s, 3p, 3d, things of that nature, right? So when that 1486 electron volt photon energy is falling on my sample, then all the elements whose binding energy is below 1486, all those electrons, irrespective of the element, they all absorb that photon energy, and after absorbing that photon energy, they are emitted. Okay, of course, the absorption will depend on the cross-sectional area, which will depend on the jet number as well as the incident photon energy and the original binding energy of the electron from where it is coming out, right? So accordingly, you will see that all the elements, different states electrons are emitted. And since their binding energy is different, we are able to identify that, okay, in my system, here is this lanthanum 4D, then strontium 3D comes here, lanthanum 4P comes here. So all these different states are located. This is oxygen 1s. So since different elements, different electronic states have different binding energy, they all appear at different binding energy scale in this whole survey spectra. So since we are recording all the electrons which are coming out, therefore this is called as survey spectra. So by just looking at the survey spectra, we can get an idea that what are the elements present in my system. Okay, then we can just focus on a particular element's characteristic and have a detailed analysis. This is, for instance, shown for oxygen element 1s electrons. So oxygen 1s electron has a binding energy close to 530 electron volt, and we can get an idea that, okay, this is how the variation of oxygen 1s spectra looks like. Okay, so this kind of experiment one can do using X-ray photoelectron spectroscopy. Now, here is the example of Fe3O4. Yesterday we talked about how do we grow the thin films of Fe3O4. So since suppose my thickness of the film is only 2 nanometer or 1 nanometer, our X-ray diffraction is not that powerful to really show the signature of the formation of Fe3O4. But since X-ray photoelectron spectroscopy is a highly surface sensitive technique, it can allow us to really understand that what kind of phase Fe3O4 this iron oxide is forming in this particular film. Because iron oxide is a very peculiar system. It can be present in FeO phase, it can be present in Fe2O3, it can be present in Fe3O4. If it is deposited in the presence of vacuum, you can have a signature of Fe phase also. Now, in all these phases, if either you have Fe or FeO or Fe3O4 or Fe2O3, in all these phases, the charge state of iron is different. And if their charge state is different, the emitted electrons' kinetic energy will be different, right? So Fe, if it is only in iron state, then the binding energy of the emitted 2p electron of iron should appear at 706 electron volt. If it is present in, say, FeO phase, then you see a certain satellite structure in this FeO spectra. If your system is having Fe2O3, then your peak positions are relatively same, but their satellite structure appears at higher binding energy. Now, Fe3O4 being composed of FeO plus Fe2O3, so the satellite structure of both the phases, FeO and Fe2O3, both of them are present in the system, and then they form a rather broad structure. And that is what is shown here in this 2 nanometer Fe3O4. So just by looking into their binding energy position or the satellite energy positions, one can get an idea that what kind of oxidation state of the iron is present or different other transition metal element present in the system. This is some kind of experiments that one can do using X-ray photoelectron spectroscopy. Now, as I said that using this X-ray photoelectron spectroscopy, we are ejecting electrons from the core level, which are their characteristic. Now, it will not give us information about the valence band spectroscopy. Why? Because of course, it can be that the resolution may not be that great, but to know the behavior close to the Fermi level, which actually controls most of our electrical properties in the system, we really need to probe the electrons ejecting from the valence band. and that is where we use this ultraviolet light sources. So these ultraviolet light sources, when they eject electron, of course, the binding energy of the ejected photoelectron is much lower as compared to the core level. So that is why you can see that this is representing the valence band spectra, which is entirely different from the core level spectra, because in the core level spectra you can see that the binding energy is way beyond this valence band spectra, and also they were the characteristic of the individual elements, whereas in the valence band, since your most of the outermost electrons are participating in that hybridized states, we really cannot easily identify that whether this electron which is ejected is arising because of the lanthanum or the strontium or the manganese or the oxygen. Those distinctions we cannot make as we could have made it in X-ray photoelectron spectroscopy. But it gives us information about the hybridized molecular orbitals, number one. Number two, it also gives us information about whether the system is a metallic or an insulating. In your metallic system, what you should expect that if at Fermi level, you should have a finite density of state, which is shown here. You can see here that the same material, this La.7 SrMnO3, it is known to show a high temperature semiconducting state to low temperature metallic state transition close to 350 Kelvin. So if I record its valence band spectra away beyond 350 and below 350, then we should be able to make a distinction whether the system is metallic or non-metallic. So here you can see from this valence band spectra that close to Fermi level, the density of a state at high temperature, which is at 385 Kelvin, it is negligible, which is consistent with the non-conducting state of LSMO at 385 Kelvin. Whereas at 148 Kelvin, it shows a finite density of a state at Fermi level, which is consistent with its metallic behavior. Similarly, this is one of the dilute magnetic semiconductors. In the undoped TiO2 had this particular valence band spectra. But with iron doping in the system, it created an additional state in the valence band spectra. So that means after doping, it has created an additional state. But what is the origin of that additional state? What is its nature? We cannot actually confirmly say using this just a wide look at valence band spectra. To really understand that aspect, one has to do this resonant photo emission spectroscopy. That I will talk in detail a little bit later. But before going into those details, I will just briefly talk about what other measurements also one can do using this ultraviolet photoelectron spectroscopy. One can get an idea of the work function. How do we get that work function information? So you record your valence band spectra at very low photon energy and just record all the emitted electrons binding energy. So when you plot them, then at what is work function? Work function is nothing but the minimum energy required to eject the free electron available at the surface. Right? Because those free electrons are not actually free, rather they are some kind of quasi-bounded state which is being held by some kind of local potential, because the moment those free electrons try to escape the surface, it creates a kind of effective positive potential at your surface, and that effective positive potential tries to pull that electron back, and that is why your free electron is not completely free and they do not leave the surface. Okay, so because of that, this is how we define the work function, right? So those free electrons which are just available to eject with the minimum kinetic energy, right? So that will, or the yeah, of course. So if I can probe that particular electron, then we can actually measure the work function of the given material. So I just recorded the whole binding energy spectra of the emitted photoelectron from the valence band. So those free electrons will have the minimum kinetic energy, because they are just available to eject from the I'm sorry, it will have the maximum kinetic energy. So at the binding energy scale, they will appear at the very high binding energy sites. So if you look at this cutoff position, and from that cutoff position, we can actually get an idea that, okay, this is these are the free electrons which are just available to come out from the sample surface. So just by subtracting with the incident photon energy, we can get an idea of the work function present in this system. Another experiment that we can do is this band alignment of this system. And how do we do that? Suppose if I'm making an heterostructure, if I'm making an heterostructure of say p-n junction type of material, or any two different metallic system, or any two different semiconducting system, then those two materials, when they come into the contact, then they try to align their Fermi level. And because of their tendency to align the Fermi level, there is a band offset either in the conduction band or in the valence band. And because of that band offset, it actually allows whether you're in a given rectifying behavior, whether the majority carriers are the, or the injected carriers are the electrons or the holes. So those kinds of experiment also one can do. So this is one such example of this system where chromium oxide is integrated with this gallium oxide. And you can see that just by looking into the core level position of say chromium and the valence band onset position of this chromium oxide as well as gallium oxide, using this particular formula, one can get an idea of the valence band offset. Okay, and once we have the information of the valence band offset, then one can get the information of conduction band offset by knowing the binding energy of these individual layers. I'm sorry for this equation. This is not delta EC, rather this is delta EV. Okay, and in this equation, this is the notation. This is the model which was proposed by Karot and their co-workers, where they have shown that the valence band offset can be estimated by understanding the difference in the core level of the individual elements, and this particular expression where the valence band maxima of individual layers of gallium oxide as well as chromium oxide has been taken care into the consideration. So that kind of experiment also one can do, which is very vital for different types of heterostructures to know that what kind of valence band offset or the conduction band offset is present in the system. Okay, so this is another thing that one can do using this valence band spectra. Now coming to resonant photoemission spectroscopy. What is resonant photoemission spectroscopy? In resonant photoemission spectroscopy, but before going into that, let's briefly talk about the normal photoemission spectroscopy. What normal photoemission spectroscopy does in the valence band mode. Suppose my transition metal element has the configuration of 3p6 3dn. And if I shine an incident photon with energy say h nu, then that h nu in a normal photoemission process, what it does, it excites an electron from this dn level, and your intermediate configuration will be p6 dn minus 1, right? And then you will have a photoemission. So your configuration will be p6 dn plus h nu, and then an electron emitted from dn. So your electrons left in the d state will be p6 dn minus 1 plus photoelectron, right? Now suppose you have tuned your incident photon energy in such a way that it is just equal to the energy difference between p to d states. So what it will do, it can also excite the electron from this p level to d level. And if it excites the electron from p level to d level, then you will have an intermediate configuration which is given by p5 and dn plus 1, because an electron from p6 has gone into dn. So this becomes p5 and this becomes dn plus 1. But then that is energetically unstable. So again, that excited electron comes back to the p state, But before coming back to P state, the possible emitted photon energy which could have happened, that photon energy is used to knock out another electron from D level, which is already present there, something like OJ electron spectroscopy. So again, that this excited electron of Dn comes back to P5, so it becomes P6. But before coming back, that possible emitted photon energy which could have happened is now expended in knocking out electron from Dn. So again, this becomes Dn minus 1. So what does that mean? That means at that particular photon energy, there are now two possible channels of photo emission. One is this normal photo emission, where you have a direct emission of electron from D level, and another channel is an electron is excited from P to D, and then that excited electron comes back to P, and that before coming back, it knocks out another electron in the excited D, which is like OJ electron emission. So the two possible channels are there available at that particular photon energy, and that means the photo absorption cross-sectional area considerably increases, or the probability of photo emission at that photon energy considerably increases. So what does that mean? That means the intensity of the photo emission at that photon energy should be considerably higher than other incident photon energy values of the valence band spectrum. Now remember, for different transition metal elements present in different states, the energy difference between this 3p to 3d is different. So in a valence band spectra, which so far we could not attribute that what was its origin of different features in that valence band spectra, if any feature is attributed to the transition metal element, we can really identify that what kind of transition metal element is present in this system, in that, or what transition metal element is attributing to the valence band spectra for that particular feature. So since the photon energy or the energy difference between 3p to 3d is different for different photon, for different transition metal element in different states, it also allows us to probe what kind of charge state of the transition metal element has given to a particular feature in the valence band spectra. Now you will understand it in a better way if I show you from this particular example. This is one of this iron doped cerium oxide system. Now in this iron doped cerium oxide system, we know that cerium oxide, in cerium oxide, cerium should be present in 4+ state. But because of the oxygen vacancy, because of the iron doping, you can have some formation of cerium 3+ state. So in your system, you can have a mixture of cerium 3+ as well as cerium 4+. So if you just record its valence band spectra, you get this valence band spectra something like this. Okay, so you have different features coming in this valence band spectra, but you really do not know whether what is the origin of these individual features, whether it arises because of the oxygen, or it arises because of the cerium 3+, or it arises because of the cerium 4+. To really understand that, what we did, we varied the incident photon energy and recorded their valence band spectra. So we recorded the valence band spectra at different incident photon energy. Okay. And how did we choose that incident photon energy? We have some information available in literature or from the calculation that the energy difference between cerium 4d to 4f is close to 122 electron volt or 124 electron volt. So accordingly, we varied the incident photon energy from say 110 electron volt to 130 electron volt and recorded the valence band spectra at all these incident photon energy. So some of the representative spectra are shown here. You can see When we recorded this valence band spectra at 118 electron volt, we had this particular behavior. Then we increased the incident photon energy at 121. This intensity considerably increased. At 122, this intensity further increased. At 124, now the intensity is coming down. Okay. Whereas this particular feature shows maximum intensity close to 125 electron. Now, what we did, we plotted the intensity of these individual features with respect to incident photon energy. And then what we saw, that this particular feature A showed maxima close to 122 electron volt, whereas this particular feature B showed maxima close to 125 electron volt. Remember, when cerium is present in 3+, then the energy difference between 4D to 4F is 122, whereas for cerium 4+, the energy difference is 125 electron volt. So from this simple experiment, one can confirm that this first feature, which is appearing close to the Fermi level is our zero binding energy. The first feature is attributed to the cerium 3+, which is nothing but the defect state in the system. Because in undoped cerium oxide, you do not expect the cerium 3+ to be present in the system. Number one. Number two, the feature appearing at higher binding energy arises because of the cerium 4+. So this kind of experiment one can do to really understand whether a particular feature in the valence band spectra belongs to what state of transition metal element or the rare earth element present in the system. And of course, to do this kind of experiment, we have to record valence band spectra at different incident photon energy. So you need to tune the incident photon energy, and therefore we need to have synchrotron source for this kind of experiment. So this kind of experiment can be done only with the synchrotron source, not with the lab source. Okay, so this is one thing that one can get an idea. Another important thing is that just by looking into the profile of the intensity with respect to incident photon energy, which is also called as constant initial state plot, CIS plot, one can also get an idea whether there is a hybridization with the transition metal element with the ligand or not, because there it is understood that when you have a good hybridization with the ligand, then this intensity maxima is actually followed by anti-resonance at lower photon energy. So if you have an anti-resonance also, then that is also, that gives us information whether the transition metal element has a proper hybridization with the ligand, or what is the strength of that ligand transition metal hybridization. Now we picked up an example of dilute magnetic semiconductor to show you that how this resonant photoemission spectroscopy allows us to probe the correlation of the electrical, magnetic and magnetic properties in one of the system of iron doped TiO2. We discussed about its thin film growth yesterday, so I'm not going into that. I will just directly take you to the electronic structure and their magnetic properties. So that is how we prepared its thin film using pulse laser deposition, which confirmed that we had a single phase of enartase TiO2. Please remember, the target was rutile TiO2, but in thin film we had this enartase phase formation. Why? Because the substrate and the temperature condition of the substrate and the oxygen partial pressure during deposition was chosen in such a way that we obtained a single phase of enartase TiO2. You can always ask a question that yesterday you told that PLD is good for retaining the stoichiometry, but how come your target is rutile, but in thin film you are having enartase phase? Please remember, stoichiometry is a different thing and phase is a different thing. Phase is something which is governed by the temperature and the oxygen partial pressure that your evaporants look at when they are reorganizing on the substrate surface. as well as the substrate lattice parameters. So those, the phase is different from the stoichiometry. TiO2 has a stoichiometry of 1:2, Ti1 oxygen 2. That is a stoichiometry that is maintained in the film, but the phase is not maintained, because we know that TiO2 can be obtained in different phases. It can be stable in anatase phase also. It can be present in Brookite phase also, Magnelli phase also. So there are different phases possible as far as TiO2 is concerned. So the phase can be tuned by properly choosing your substrate as well as properly choosing your deposition condition. So the present set of study is based on the anatase phase of TiO2. So from this anatase phase of TiO2, after confirming that the grown films are like epitaxial films, so that means the possibly grain sizes are much larger, very less contribution of grain boundaries, and all of them are behaving like a single crystals because they are retaining the epitaxy with respect to lanthanum element. Now, we doped iron in TiO2 with an intention that iron substitutes for titanium in this system. So iron should not form a metal cluster. How do I confirm that? Yesterday we discussed that if iron was a metal cluster, then the kind of bonding that one should expect between iron and iron, that should be of metallic bonding. But if iron is present in some kind of ionic state, some kind of oxidation state, then your binding energy will be higher, because of course we know that the binding energy of say iron 2p electron for iron in 0 state will be lower than Fe2 plus state, which will be further lower than Fe3 plus state. So as your ionic state of iron keeps on increasing, the binding energy position also keeps on increasing. So if you look at this binding energy spectra of this iron X-ray photoelectron or core level spectra of Fe2p, what it shows that we do not see any signature close to 706 electron volt, which suggests that iron is not present in metallic cluster. Iron has some ionic state, number one. Number two, interestingly, the titanium also revealed that it is present in titanium 3 plus as well as titanium 4 plus state. You can see that titanium 4 plus is appearing at higher binding energy as compared to titanium 3 plus. So as you keep on increasing the ionic state, the binding energy position also keeps on increasing, right? So from this X-ray photoelectron spectroscopy core level spectra, we can get an idea that what is the ionic state of the dopant as well as the host matrix. Now, if you look at this valence band spectra, the valence band spectra shows that at Fermi level, which is the zero binding energy, we have a finite density of state. That means my system should behave like a degenerate semiconductor or a metallic behavior. How do I know that it is metallic behavior? So if you plot its resistivity with respect to temperature, we should see that with decrease in temperature, resistivity should decrease, or a positive temperature coefficient of resistance. And another thing is that we had after iron doping a new feature appearing, right? So we had to understand the origin of this feature A and the origin of this feature B. How do I do that? To confirm that, we varied the incident photon energy and recorded this spectra so that we can plot the intensity of this feature A as well as feature B and see whether they show any maxima or not. Because we know that titanium 3p to 3d will have a different photoabsorption energy with respect to iron. And oxygen, as such, it is known that the cross-sectional area keeps on decreasing with incident photon energy in this photon energy range. So if it is arising because of the oxygen, then its intensity should be either constant or gradually decrease with increase in photon energy. And therefore, we recorded this valence band spectra, you can see here, at different incident photon energy. So as consistent with the finite density of a state at Fermi level, we had a finite, a metallic-like behavior at room temperature. Now, this is very intriguing because we know that TiO2 has a wide band gap of 3.4 electron volt. But as I discussed yesterday also, if in my system we have sufficient oxygen vacancy densities, then those oxygen vacancies form a shallow donor level just below the conduction band, and they can give rise to sufficient free electrons. And if the density of such oxygen vacancy is very high, then they can just merge or coincide with your Fermi level. And that is why we are having a finite density of state at Fermi level. And here is the cartoon which is shown here, that suppose in my system we had this oxygen vacancy. Earlier this oxygen, had it been there, this was connected with the 2 titanium with its neighboring ions, right? But in absence of that oxygen vacancy, the unattended 2 free electrons are available now. Those 2 free electrons can be either delocalized, or one of them can be delocalized and another electron can go to their neighboring titanium 4 plus and will convert it into titanium 3 plus, or both of them can go to their neighboring titanium 4 plus and convert into titanium 3 plus. So all these 3 possibilities are there. So we picked up the intermediate one. So just imagine that per oxygen vacancies, we have 1 free electron, and one of the free electron is converting titanium 4 plus to titanium 3 plus. So that means we have free electrons also and some titanium 3 plus defect state also. So how do I really confirm that we had titanium 3 plus? So X-ray photoelectron spectroscopy had indications that in my system titanium is present in 3 plus as well as 4 plus also. So the indication of titanium 3 plus suggested that oxygen vacancy induced free electrons are converting some of the titanium 4 plus into titanium 3 plus also. Number 1. Number 2, the finite density of state at Fermi level suggested that in my system we had some free electrons available. That means there are some delocalized electron also. So that is why we have adopted an intermediate approach, that possibly the 2 free electrons associated with 1 oxygen vacancy, one of them goes to neighboring titanium 4 plus, is converting it into titanium 3 plus, and one of them is kind of delocalized. So somewhere this kind of picture is there, which is giving rise to a finite density of state at Fermi level as well as high temperature metallic behavior in the system. Now to confirm that valence band spectra, in this valence band spectra we had this feature A, we had this feature B, we do not know its origin, so we recorded this valence band spectra at different incident photon energy and plotted its intensity with respect to incident photon energy. Now you see, this feature A shows maxima close to 46 electron volt, whereas feature B shows maxima close to 56 electron volt. And it so happens that the energy difference between titanium 3p to 3d is 46 for titanium 3 plus, whereas for iron the gap between 3p to 3d is 56 electron volt. So what does it confirm? That feature A arises because of titanium 3 plus, whereas feature B arises because of iron present in the system. Okay, so in this valence band spectra, this was arising because of titanium 3 plus. What was the origin of titanium 3 plus? That was the oxygen vacancy. So oxygen vacancy induced defect state, it forming an energy state very close to the Fermi level, as well as the iron doped state is forming at slightly away from that defect state. This is feature B. Now another interesting thing that you can see, that feature B also shows maxima close to 46 electron volt, which happens to be titanium 3 plus. What does that mean? That means that at feature B we have a combined contribution from titanium 3 plus as well as iron derived state, iron 3d states. So iron 3d state is the magnetic impurity that we have doped in this system. Titanium 3 plus is the oxygen vacancy induced defect state. So this confirmed that in my system there is a coupling of oxygen vacancy induced defect state with the magnetic impurity. Or In other words, at the Fermi level also, we had the contribution of the iron as well as titanium state. So that means our carriers are interacting with the magnetic impurities also. Okay, and yesterday we discussed that how did we confirm that, okay, we have carrier mediated magnetization, we have this finite degenerate semiconducting like behavior or metallic like behavior or finite density of a state because of the free electrons created by the oxygen vacancy. How did we confirm? To confirm that, we killed that oxygen vacancy so that we have no contribution from either titanium 3 plus or we do not have any free electrons. So if you look at after annealing, the titanium 3 plus is decreased as well as there is no free carriers available. So since there is no free carriers, there is no carrier mediated magnetization and the magnetization has considerably dropped down. And that is also reflected from the semiconducting behavior of this TiO2. So these are the signatures that one can really confirm using this resonant photo emission, and that gives you an spectroscopic evidence of the magnetic impurity which is interacting with the charge carriers or the oxygen vacancy induced defect states present in this system. So these were all about using this photoelectron spectroscopy workstation which is available at Indus One synchrotron source. Now we have another beamline which is soft X-ray absorption spectroscopy beamline at Indus 2. Dr. Jha talked about this extended X-ray absorption fine structures, whereas we have some X-ray absorption near edge structure. So just close to the Fermi, just close to the photo absorption edge, we probe that how there are different features which is giving us information related to the charge state, the crystal field splitting, and just by using the polarized nature of the incident photons, one can also do this X-ray magnetic circular dichroism or X-ray linear dichroism. And I will just give you some specific examples of all these different experiments, that in what way one can do these sets of experiments. So this is also like photo absorption only. So when the incident photon energy is just equal to the energy difference between the binding energy and the conduction band, then that photon is absorbed by that photoelectron, by that electron, and it is excited to the conduction band. So in the photoelectron spectroscopy, if you remember, we have the incident photon energy and record the emitted electrons kinetic energy. Whereas in this X-ray absorption spectroscopy, we vary the incident photon energy and record the intensity of the emitted photons or the photons being absorbed by that particular material. Right, so that's the basic difference between this soft X-ray absorption spectroscopy as well as photoelectron spectroscopy. So the incident photon energy is like 100 electron volts to 1200 electron volt available at this beamline, and that allows us to probe the photoabsorption of, say, boron, carbon, nitrogen, oxygen, fluorine. All these materials are shown here in different charges, different 2p to 3p or 3d to 4f or 1s to 2p. So different absorption edges can be probed for different elements in this particular beamline. So I will show you that what information one can get. That this is one example of, say, lanthanum vanadate system. So we prepared this lanthanum vanadate system and compared their photo absorption spectra with some standard sample which is V2O5 or V2O3, and just by looking into the position of the absorption and the intensity distribution, we can really understand what is the actually charge state of different elements present in this system. So you can see here that for V2O5, the intensity of this L2 and L3 features are almost equivalent, whereas in this particular case, V2O3, the intensity of L3 is higher than L2. And in LaVO3 also the intensity of L3 is higher than L2. So that is why we concluded that this absorption spectra is very similar to V2O3 as compared to V2O5. Therefore, in my system, vanadium is present in 3+ state. So that kind of experiment one can do. And also by probing this oxygen K is the hybridization with the vanadium and the oxygen give rise to different kind of features, and one can get different information. Please remember, while photoelectron spectroscopy gives information about the occupied states, because you are exciting electron from the occupied states and we measure its kinetic energy, which was of the emitted electron from the core level. So the photoelectron spectroscopy gives information about the occupied states. Whereas in this particular case, since the electron is going from occupied states to unoccupied states, and that is what we are probing, that at what photon energy the electron is going to the unoccupied states. So the X-ray absorption spectroscopy gives us information about the unoccupied states. So if one can perform a careful analysis by overcoming the band offset, etc., at these different beam lines, one can get an idea of the complete electronic structure, one below the Fermi level and one above the Fermi level. Below the Fermi level gives information about the occupied states, and above the Fermi level it gives information about the unoccupied states. So this gives us information about the different types of electronic structure present in a given material. Here I have showed that this is one example of lanthanum vanadate, which in bulk compound it was supposed to be intermediate between this Mott-Hubbard type insulator or the charge transfer type insulator. I'm not going into that kind of material. Please remember, these insulators can be categorized in different types of material. One that we generally know is that we have a very good band gap between valence band and conduction band. That type of material is called as band gap insulators. But there are many such materials where the normal notion or the band theories predicts that the system should behave like a metal, but they do not behave like a metal. They still show insulating behavior, and that all arises because of the correlation energy when it is generally considered, and that correlation energy is generally giving rise to the insulating nature, and that sets the nature of the insulating character of the given material. So if in your given material your oxygen band is the first band just below the Fermi level, then that kind of material is called as charge transfer insulator. But if below the Fermi level the first feature arises because of the transition metal element, then that kind of insulator is called as Mott-Hubbard insulator. So all these studies can be probed using by combining this X-ray photoelectron by this valence band spectroscopy as well as X-ray absorption spectroscopy. So that kind of a study one can do. As far as this is another example of lanthanum manganese oxide. In this lanthanum manganese oxide, if you look at its crystal structure, you will see that manganese is surrounded by 6 oxygens. So you have MnO6 octahedra. Because of that MnO6 octahedra, the manganese 3D level, which is generally degenerate in just elemental states, but in the presence of MnO6 octahedra, because of the crystal field arising because of the ligands, your Mn3D energy, degenerate energy levels are split into T2G level and EG level. And since your oxygen orbital is hybridized with both manganese T2G level as well as manganese EG level, so if you are probing this oxygen KH, where your electron is actually exciting from oxygen 1s to 2p, and since we know that oxygen 2p is the outermost for the oxygen, which is hybridizing with the manganese 3D electrons, again the outermost of manganese levels, and that manganese 3D has 2 energy levels, T2G and EG. So the electron can get excited from oxygen 1s to oxygen 2p, which is either hybridized with the oxygen manganese T2G or manganese EG. So accordingly, now since the occupancy in this T2G and EG will be different, So their intensity will be also different. So just by probing this T2G state feature as well as in EG state feature, so the separation between these two energy states will give us information about the crystal field splitting, number one. Number two, you can also note that unoccupancy, higher is the unoccupancy, higher will be its intensity. So it's not unlike this photoelectron spectroscopy. Of course, since we are probing this unoccupied states only, therefore higher the unoccupancy in a given state, higher will be its intensity. So that kind of precaution one should always take care. Okay, so that is what we can get information as far as X-ray absorption spectroscopy is concerned. So we can get the information about the charge state, we can get the information about the crystal field splitting present in the system. We can also, by combining this valence band spectra or the information obtained from resonant photoemission, because from resonant photoemission we can get an idea whether close to Fermi level the first feature arises because of only oxygen or the hybridized oxygen transition metal or only the transition metal. So by combining that resonant photoemission information with this X-ray absorption spectroscopy, which gives us the complete mapping of the electronic structure across the Fermi level, we can get an information whether the given material is like Mott-Hubbard type insulator or the charge transfer type insulator. All these studies one can do. Another important thing that we can do by using the polarized light nature of this incident X-rays, one can do X-ray magnetic circular dichroism, which is very versatile because it gives information about the elemental specific magnetic information, and it is highly sensitive. And importantly, it gives us information about the contribution arising because of the spin part as well as orbital part of the system. So this is one such example of, say, or different materials which are shown, CuFe2O4. So how do we do this experiment? Please remember that the absorption of a particular polarized photon will depend on the spin alignment. So if for opposite spin alignment, the particular polarized photon is absorbed differently. So if I record my X-ray absorption spectra in different polarized states of the incident photon and then take its difference, then that difference spectra will give us information about the net magnetization, because that net magnetization arises because of difference in spin or difference in, what should I say, up spin as well as down spin number of electrons or spin asymmetry. So that kind of information can be probed using this X-ray magnetic circular dichroism. And here is one such example of, say, Fe3O4 again. So why is this important? Because Fe3O4, as I discussed yesterday, can be comprised of FeO plus Fe2O3, number one. So we have iron in 1 iron in 2 plus and 2 iron in 3 plus. And importantly, in Fe3O4, there are two sites, tetrahedral site and octahedral site. At octahedral site, we have equal contribution of Fe2 plus and an Fe3 plus, and they act parallel to each other. Whereas tetrahedral site is occupied by Fe3 plus, and tetrahedral site interacts in antiferromagnetically with respect to octahedral site. So the Fe3 plus at tetra and Fe3 plus at octa, they completely cancel each other. So the net moment we should get is only because of Fe2 plus present at octahedral site. How do I confirm? Because we can do XMCD, and since XMCD is element specific, it will give us all this information. You can see here from this XMCD spectra. We have this B site. B site is nothing but the octahedral site. So Fe2 plus feature appears here. Fe3 plus feature appears here. Now the signal of XMCD is negative for both of them. So that suggests that octahedral site Fe2 plus and Fe3 plus, they are parallel to each other. Whereas the tetrahedral site Fe3 plus, it has a negative positive sign different from octahedral site. So that means tetrahedral site is interacting antiferromagnetically with octahedral site. So this Fe3 plus moments are cancelling each other. So the net moment we are getting because of Fe2 plus. So all this information can be brought out from X-ray magnetic circular diffusion. No other magnetometer technique can give you this kind of elemental information. And just by doing this kind of calculation, we can also get an idea whether what is the actual moment contribution coming from the orbital part, what is the actual moment contribution coming from the spin part of the system, and all this information can be obtained. So from this 150 nanometer Fe3O4 thin film, what we observed that the net magnetization was close to 4 mu b, because okay, in Fe3O4, as I said, that the net moment is because of Fe2 plus moment, which is present at the octahedral site. So this Fe2 plus, if you look at their electronic configuration, is like 3d6. And that 3d6 electronic configuration, that means we are talking about the 4 unpaired spins. And those 4 unpaired spins give rise to 4 mu b. So this 150 nanometer was behaving like a normal Fe3O4, whereas this 2 nanometer Fe3O4 film had a huge contribution coming from the orbital magnetic moment, which is generally quenched because of the orbital quenching. And orbital quenching arises because of the strong crystal field present in the system. So as your surface contribution keeps on increasing, the role of crystal field keeps on decreasing, and therefore orbital moment is also now available to give you the overall contribution. So this again gives us information about how the spin part is contributing, how the orbital part is contributing to the overall magnetization of a given system. Okay. Now that was about one particular specific. Suppose if you are making some heterostructure and those two heterostructures happen to be of different types, then that at the interface they can align or they can interact in a different fashion. Okay, so that information also one can do. This is one such example of, say, again, one material is LSMO, another material is SRCO 2.5. Both are ferromagnetically, but when they are integrated by preparing their thin films in the heterostructure, then at the interface they interact antiferromagnetically. And how did we confirm this? Just by looking at the eccentricity signal of cobalt and manganese together. If you look at this cobalt signal, here it is positive, whereas the manganese signal, it is negative here. So that means the cobalt moment is acting opposite to the manganese moment. So at the interface, these two ferromagnetic layers are interacting antiferromagnetically, and that gives rise to the unusual exchange biasing present in the system. That is another, I mean, a very crucial information that one can get as far as the magnetic heterostructures are concerned. Then finally, I will just say that another important aspect that one can do, as I said, that when we have this crystal field splitting, then in that crystal field splitting, the electrons can be populated in different orbitals. They can be populated in T2G levels, they can be populated into the EG levels, or in different way. So we can also get an idea that in what particular orbital, whether it is the in-plane orbital in which the electrons have occupied, or it is the out-of-plane orbitals in which the electrons are occupied. That kind of information one can get by performing X-ray linear dichroism. Because when your incident polarization vector is parallel to the sample surface, then that intensity will give you information about the unoccupancy in the in-plane orbital. Whereas if your incident electric field vector is polarized perpendicular to the sample surface, then it will give you information about the unoccupancy in the out of plane orbitals. And the difference between these two will give you information that in which particular orbital electron is present in the system. So this kind of experiment one can do. There is another upgradation that is coming up at the new beamline BL26, where the incident photon energy is like varied from 1.7 to 9 kilo electron volt, and this particular beamline will comprise of different experimental stations consisting of X-ray absorption spectroscopy, X-ray photoelectron spectroscopy, and then X-ray scattering kind of experiment. So that will allow to probe many more elements, which is not possible at present at these available beamlines. So these are some of the publications which have emerged from these studies, which consist of our users as well as from our own students. And I'm thankful to all these gentlemen. This is my present group, and who worked very effectively in running this whole system, and they have used or they have brought up some changes to all these systems. She is Komal Bapna, who did extensively on this iron doped TiO2 using this resonant photoemission spectroscopy. At present, she is scientist at NPL. She is Shalja Tiwari, and he is Dr. Ram Prakash. They all are faculty at different places. They were the initial starters of doing this photoelectron spectroscopy system. His Pankaj Pandey and Manish, they were the initial students in bringing out this X-ray absorption spectroscopy. He was one of the students who is now inspired faculty, and he did that cerium oxide example was taken out with him. And they are Digvijay and Tanvir, they all are doing at different places at present. They have used all these facilities at different times, and these are the present set of students who have been troubling us quite a lot in near times. And finally, I'm thankful to my director and the director at RRCAT, my senior colleague, Dr. DM Fasi, who is really instrumental in bringing all this show, my engineers, Vadikarji, Rakeshji, Sharadji, and all other beamline in charges and other operation group of RRCAT Indore. Thank you very much for your attention, and I shall be happy to take up your any question if you may have. Please let me know.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ramjana ji. Now the house is open for the questions and queries. Anyone? Any question? Yeah, Kashif has raised his hand. I will just unmute you. Please unmute yourself, Kashif.
Hello.
Yes, unmute yourself.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you, sir, for last nice talk.
Thank you, sir.
I wanted to know whether how we are going to get time in doing the measurements. Whether we can send the samples, or it is open that we can come and do the measurements.
Okay, at present, because of the pandemic situation, the users movement is not allowed. So what we can do is we are taking samples by post at present.
So I can give you the samples.
Sure, sir.
Okay. Thank you, sir.
But of course, before doing that, please do apply online, and we'll give you the time for doing that experiment, and then you can send your samples.
So, but on user portal, I have registered for at the user portal, but it is not giving me any link to submit the proposal.
Sorry, please repeat the question again.
Sir, on the new portal where we have to register,
yes,
there is no on the dashboard. After registering on the dashboard, there is no link where we can give the user form or submit any form there.
I think it is quite possible, but just check that. I mean, I got some call that it's not possible to submit the research proposal. I discussed with my colleagues, and it appeared that there are some pop-up windows which is available, and one has to really expand that.
Yeah, it's possible. You are right, Dr. Ramjana.
Yes.
One of my colleagues, junior colleagues, she got it, and now it is working.
Yes.
When I talked to you that time, there was some problem. I don't know.
Okay,
But
okay.
now it is working. So you can
Yes.
check, Kashif. You will be able to do it. If there is any problem, we can discuss it.
Yes.
And
Okay, okay, sir. Thank you, sir.
Okay.
any other question? Yes. Okay. Unmute yourself.
Hello, sir.
Hi.
Sir, I want to request you to please explain orbital quenching. I have heard many places orbital quenching, but can't understand it.
Okay, 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 fine. See, in your system, what is the origin of magnetic moment? The origin of magnetic moment is your electron, right? So any motion of the electron is associated with some kind of local magnetic field, and when you apply some external magnetic field, then that uh, field or the moment that it is creating to align that particular magnetic moment in the direction of magnetic field is giving rise to the overall magnetic moment, right? So if you look at your electrons motion, there are two types of motion. One is the spin motion and another is your orbital motion. So accordingly, we have two types of contribution that should come from the electron. One is the spin magnetic moment, another is the orbital magnetic moment, right? But in your system, if you look at your crystal structure, then what do we see? That your orbitals are kind of, because of the strong coupling with the crystal field, those orbital magnetic moments are not free to overcome that crystal field, to align as per the external magnetic field. Okay, so therefore that crystal field kinds of freezes that orbital moment to really respond to the external field, and therefore only the spin part generally tries to align and gives you the net magnetization. Okay, so therefore what do we get is only the contribution because of the spin magnetic moment. But if you look at the rare earth elements, then in the rare earth elements, the unpaired electrons are arising from the 4f level, and that 4f level is kind of screened from the outermost electrons, okay, or outermost orbitals. So for those 4f electrons, the crystal field effect is not sufficient enough to freeze. So therefore, when you put those rare earth elements in presence of some magnetic field, then in that particular case, it's not only the spin magnetic moment, but also the orbital magnetic moment, which actually aligns with respect to the external magnetic field. Therefore, for the rare earth elements, you will see that your net magnetization is given by J, which is L plus S, right? So there you have a combined contribution coming from spin as well as orbital magnetic moment. Whereas in case of transition metal oxide systems, since your unpaired electron is present in the outermost, which is just your 3D electrons, and they are under huge influence with the crystal field, and that is not allowing that orbital moment to align in the direction of field. So there your net magnetization is given only by spin magnetic moment only. So that is how this orbital magnetic moment is quenched for transition metal oxide systems.
Thank you so much, sir.
Welcome.
Any question? Any more question? Just raise your hand. Yes, Sonu Kumar. Yes, I'll make. Okay, Sonu. Yes, Sonu.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Am I audible?
Yes,
Yes, you are.
Yes, sir. Actually, sir, you have mentioned one term, binding energy. So generally, whatever knowledge I have, and I know that binding energy basically associates with nucleus and something like that. And also in photoelectric equation, you have added this term. So, sir, I could not understand how can one add in photoelectric equation this term binding energy. Sir, can you explain? Can you explain further a little briefly?
तुम्हारी दोस्ती तुम्ही से लड़ाई है, ऐसा वैसा है सोनू जी। ये जो बाइंडिंग एनर्जी टर्म आपने न्यूक्लियस से जुड़ा हुआ देखा है, तो आप ये देखिए ना, ये जो इलेक्ट्रॉन है, इलेक्ट्रॉन्स आर रिवॉल्विंग अराउंड द न्यूक्लियस, और उसको बाउंड कौन कर रहा है? वो किसके कारण बंधे हुए हैं? that
Nucleus.
binding is arising because of its interaction with the nucleus. Okay, so those electrons which are nearest to the nucleus, उसको nucleus बहुत जोर से पकड़ के रखता है. Okay, and therefore their binding energy is much higher. And as you go away from the nucleus, from 1s to 2s to 2p to 3s 3p etc., जैसे जैसे आप दूर जा रहे हैं, your radial extent is also increasing, therefore their binding energy starts decreasing. Okay, so जब हम बोलते हैं that when my incident photon energy is higher than the binding energy, तो binding energy किसका? इलेक्ट्रॉन का. किसके कारण? न्यूक्लियस के साथ इंटरेक्शन के कारण. तो न्यूक्लियस जिस एनर्जी से उसको बांध के रखा है, अगर आपने उस एनर्जी से ज्यादा इंसिडेंट फोटोन एनर्जी दिया तो वो इलेक्ट्रॉन अपना चुपचाप निकल जाता. ठीक है, सो दैट बाइंडिंग एनर्जी व्हिच आई एम शोइंग यू हियर, दैट इज अराइजिंग बिकॉज ऑफ द इंटरेक्शन ऑफ दैट इलेक्ट्रॉन विथ द न्यूक्लियस इटसेल्फ. ओके,
Yes, sir.
यस सर. बाकी जो न्यूक्लियॉन्स के बीच में आपस में जो इंटरेक्शन होते हैं वो एक अलग लेवल का बाइंडिंग एनर्जी है. दैट वी आर नॉट प्रोबिंग हियर एट ऑल. हियर वी आर प्रोबिंग द बाइंडिंग एनर्जी ऑफ द इलेक्ट्रॉन which is arising because of its interaction with the nucleus, which is positively charged.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. It is clear for me. Thanks, sir.
Okay, sir. Thank you.
Anyone else? Just raise your hand. Any more question? Okay, so thank you very much, Dr. Ramjana ji. We are thankful to you for this
Thank you, ma'am.
presentation and the interaction with us also. And I hope that all the candidates or all the participants, they had a nice time with you also. It was nice to interact and to listen to these things because many of us, we do not know much about the Indus 1 and Beamline 1 and Beamline 2, and you and Dr. Esenja, both of us, everything was quite in detail. So it was quite informative and scientific. Thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, and have a great time.
Thank you.